Welcome to Alienating the Audience, a podcast that analyzes the glorious underbelly of science fiction. I'm Andrew Heaton, the thinking man's nerd. Today, we are going to talk about Stargate, and I have to preface this with most of the series and books and films we talk about, I feel comfortable coming on and really weighing in on the issue. This episode, I feel, is more like when you encounter somebody that sees someone who speaks Spanish and they go, hola, ¿cómo estás? And then the person actually speaks Spanish and they go, I don't actually know Spanish. I just wanted you to be impressed with me. That's the level of Stargate knowledge that I have. I have been watching the film and multiple episodes and reading about it in preparation for this. So I've brought on a couple of very knowledgeable Stargate enthusiasts. Joining us is AJ West, who is a warlord on Reddit. He is the subreddit founder for Stargate. So you're like kind of the head fan, I think.
I don't know about that, but yes, hello. I was the creator. I think I just got to it first. 10 years ago when Reddit started asking people if they wanted to create their own community, I just created it because I was super into Stargate. So, and still am.
And he's humble too, the hero we need. And we are also joined by Mika McKinnon, who had a hand in Stargate. You're not just a fan, you're one of the people behind Stargate, Mika.
Yes, indeed. Literally behind it. And that my handwriting is all over the sets and scenes.
Right. But not just because you have beautiful handwriting, because you are specifically a science consultant. You're a physicist, I believe, and a science consultant for various franchises.
That's right. I'm in Vancouver, BC, home of pretty much all the best sci-fi. And every time you need a scientist on set, it's me who shows up.
Man, Mika, you have apparently you're winning at life. This sounds great. So you get to live in an area with a lot of trees and work on science fiction?
Yes, I specialize in disasters, and I will tell you, I picked my long-term home in being on bedrock, but in earthquake territory, just out of reach of all the landslides, slightly too high for the floods, in a region with emergency response this UN recognized. I was extremely strategic about this.
Wait, so is Vancouver like the safest place in North America?
It's a really, really good place to be. Our urban search and rescue team is kind of world famous.
Wow. Okay, you know what? This is what I'm going to bring up when I meet people from Vancouver from now on. I'll be like, I heard your search and rescue team's fantastic. And then they'll be like, hell, if I get to talk to somebody from Kansas, I'm like, you guys sure did good at football this year. Like, apparently you guys, like ambulances and stuff. I'll be like hats off. And AJ, aren't you also Canadian, but you're on the other side?
Yeah, I'm Canadian. I live in Montreal, which is in the province of Quebec, here in Canada. So
we are all speaking French right now through the miracle of Skype. It's auto-translating all of this as we do. And if you're listening at home, you too are speaking French. So, and then real quick, so Mika, as the science consultant, because the episodes that you told me to check out, which were fun, by the way, were largely Stargate Atlantis. Were you involved through the whole franchise? Did you come in through Stargate Atlantis specifically? And what kind of stuff did you do as a science writer?
So in the very beginning with Stargate SG-1, the science consultant for the show was Kenny Gibbs' high school physics textbook.
Okay.
And as they got more popularity and more support and more funding, they started adding on more and more science and came to the local university and said, we need a string theorist.
Nice.
And I'm not a string theorist. I'm a geophysicist. I deal with broken rocks.
Hold on. I just have this image in my head of a Hollywood producer kicking the door open to a physics department and just shouting, "We need a string theorist," and that being the way these deals are made.
That's actually happened to me on set. Literally, like the show, we need science over here, and like come running across set to like emergency fix equations. It literally is exactly how you're imagining it. So I wasn't a string theorist, but my buddy Steve was. So I shoved him at the job and went, "I love this show. Go fix it for me," and shoved him at it. And so he started as Stargate's first science consultant, and he literally did his thesis work. Was first published on Stargate and only several years later in actual academic journals.
Wow.
But then Steve found a pretty girl and a telescope in South America and left.
Okay.
So I took over his job instead, realizing they didn't need a string theorist. That's just like the cleverest scientist they could come up with. They needed a creative and enthusiastic scientist. So I show up on the first day and they sat me down on John Shepard's bed, and I have no idea what any of my instructions were, because that's, the tall, dark, handsome character you're supposed to have a crush on.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wait, hold on. Just because I'm new to the series, who did Don Shepard play? Or who is Don Shepard?
Don Shepard is the name of the character. So he is the Mensa helicopter pilot action hero, tall, dark, and handsome, who runs around saving lives throughout Atlantis.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure this wasn't some very bizarre, like, questionable practice of like, well, yeah, directors all keep beds in their office and like people come in. So this was merely on set, and you were sitting on the bed of a character.
Yep.
Okay, good.
I was in the crew quarters where they were like sitting me down in the crew quarters to wait for like the action to clear in the like all the scientist huddle. We were clearing that out so I could go in and start scrolling equations all over the place. So that was my very, very first time on set, and they were filming Stargate SG-1 at the same time. And once you've already got a scientist on set, you might as well like spread the love.
Yeah.
So it was like, you're already here. How about you go over to that set piece and kind of poke around a little bit?
Awesome. Okay, cool. That sounds like a really fun job. I know I'm now friends with a couple of Star Trek consultants, and it's like in their case, they get to go on Star Trek cruises and just hang out with the actors. And then periodically, from what I can tell, the franchise calls them and is like, "What's a wormhole again?" And they're like, "Oh," and then they science out, and then they get a paycheck. It sounds great. What I thought we would talk about is I'll point out a couple of things that I noticed just in watching the 6 of the 6,000 episodes that are out there. We'll talk about some of the characters. And we'll talk about some of the themes, which I'm very interested in. I really like kind of the underlying concepts and themes that motivate science fiction theories and what science fiction series and what they're going with. And then we might just talk about the various civilizations, because I kind of nerd out on org charts of what the relationships are. So I'll tell you, having watched 6 episodes, every episode I saw had an explosion or a threat of an explosion as the main character. Every episode had some part where they went, "We've got to blow the thing up," and it was either a question of if they'd be able to blow the thing up in time, or if it was a bad idea whether or not to blow it up. But I was like, I like that explosions are a recurring plot device in everything I saw so far.
I also particularly appreciate that the scientists' characters all have kind of a competition of who blew up the biggest thing, where it's like, "Oh, I just accidentally blew up a planet. Oh, don't mind me. Totally blew up a star. Oops, that was the solar system. My bad."
Which they actually make reference to later, right? Where the character Samantha Carter, she makes reference to, you blow up one sun and automatically everybody thinks that you can do anything. So it's something that they definitely play with kind of consistently as well. I think in the behind the scenes, there's a lot of, the behind the scenes has a lot of sort of footage of them installing these propane explosion fireball situations, right? So it's definitely their go-to pyrotechnic for sure.
Yeah. So they're aware of the fact that they're making explosions like a regular plot feature. Like they're almost joking about it at some point just because they're so frequent.
And, they have these big chunks of C4, too. It's not like a tiny little, mini-sized C4. It's a big brick of C4 that they're slapping onto the back of another piece of explosive material, right? So.
Okay, I like this. I like the idea that there was probably a dedicated C4 budget, and at some point during the writer's room, they're like, "Guys, we still have an additional 15 ounces of C4, so we got to fit in one more explosion."
There's literally bins in the prop room. They're just labeled C4. Like giant, huge Tupperware bins, like those huge, like 60 liter, what is that, 50 gallons? I don't know. Figure it out for the Americans. Well, like those huge bins of C4 where they're just like, pull it down, pull it out.
And the other thing that I noticed was that, and I suspect this plays into one of the themes, because one of the things that I found recurrent in Stargate and all of the because I've seen Stargate, I haven't seen Stargate Universe, but I've seen Stargate SG-1 and I've seen Atlantis. One of the themes that I think is played with throughout the series is the idea of intellectual and moral authority. And I first noticed that because all of the episodes, or not all, most of the episodes I saw had a relationship of a hard-headed military officer pulling rank with a bad plan and the very competent underling breathlessly explaining why it wouldn't work and then prevailing. And I was like there was some guy would like paradrop into the situation and be like, the president says to blow up the thing. And then either the general or O'Neill would be like, well, that won't work. We have to do such and such. And then they would ultimately be correct and manage to save the day. But there seemed to be this kind of playing with the idea of authority going on.
All right. This is like total back behind the scenes science tip. A lot of the arguments you see between the action heroes and the scientists, like arguing about what to do, are modeled on conversations between writer Carl Binder and his daughter, the graduate student astrophysicist. So if you just imagine a little silent, Dad, and then start the conversation, you've got a rough draft of all of those arguments.
That blows my mind. Okay, so because it seems to me that like a big driver in the series is the relationship between Jackson and O'Neill. And Jackson is the hard-headed, very like masculine, macho colonel, and I'm sorry, that's O'Neill. My bad. And Jackson is the more kind of dweeby is the word they use in the film, dweeby scientist character. And I was like, that's an interesting dichotomy that they have kind of working that out of like hard-headed military versus scientist. But that's also like a like deep motif of one of the writers and his nerdy daughter.
Oh, yeah. And you see it. So it pops up more often when you see Samantha Carter is in the SG-1. She's the brilliant scientist. So she goes through, and it's, again, that O'Neill and her, they have a more flirty relationship, so definitely not based on the father-daughter thing.
Okay.
But when you get to Stargate Atlantis, you have Shepard, who's our new O'Neill with the action hero, and McKay, who's the kind of cowardly scientist. But their conversation style is very much like sibling rivalry, and that's got that first draft happening in the dad-daughter relationship. What I love is, so she's now got her PhD and all that. She's a doctor of astrophysics. But when these were first being written, she was a grad student. And I don't know how familiar you are with grad school, but it's this very strange situation where you're developing expertise. So you go through all of those chunks of like completely confident you know everything, sudden realization you know nothing, complete confidence that like I am the best at this. Oh no, I'm never going to succeed. Like those emotional highs and lows are just compressed down.
So your 20s. That sounds like all of my 20s. That's my 20s were filled with self-righteous, I know how everything works, and then crashing realizations that I really know very, very little.
Yeah, so that pops up in this like the action soldier boss and the scientist thing just keeps coming up again and again.
Hey, AJ, what kind of themes do you see playing out over the course of Stargate? What do you see as being the issues that the series is exploring?
Yeah, well, just talking about the military situation that you were referring to, there's, of course, there's this back and forth between seniority and civilian law versus military sort of an internal affairs kind of exploration. At the beginning of the series of Stargate SG-1, this started in the mid-90s. So that I think there was just, quite a different political situation in the world.
Well,
and with
it's the Bush years, right?
In general.
So does it
and then,
predate 9/11? If it's the 90s, it would then, but it goes through 9/11.
Exactly.
Okay,
yeah. So basically, the thing that I see sort of changing over time is that that sort of American military it almost becomes self-referential, and I think in a way it's referring to this, the American military-industrial complex, and that's actually really appealing to me. There's a lot of politics that are related to there's like a Russia-American relationship as well. It's very Cold War era. They have to go to the Russians a lot to sort of wheel and deal because they have some alien technology that needs to be used for certain situations. They have to work together inevitably to defend against various enemies of Earth. Obviously, the Russians don't like how it's Team America, World Police all over again, and the rest of the world doesn't get a say in the political relationships between other galactic partners. So I think that that's something that was, I think that's a worthy commentary to make. And also it takes close to the end, I think it's season 7 before the rest of the world leaders, they start making reference to how the UN And it's not every country. It's just sort of the countries that we can trust. They list Canada's on the list. France is
Good
on
job.
the list.
Britain probably made it.
Yeah, exactly. There's like this short list of countries, prime ministers and presidents who have been notified that there's a super ship flying overhead and it's about to destroy the planet. And maybe we were going to need to work together here for a planetary-wide defense. So, yeah, the Russians definitely start to get more integrated in by the end. They get their own SG team where they're allowed to sort of lead their own missions off-world. Of course, the stereotype of they're like corrupt and, they have a sort of
they're swilling vodka and ice skating with a bear.
Right, exactly. And so I don't know if they're portrayed in the best light.
So that's my follow-up question, is because this is interesting because you're both Canadian, or at least you both live in Canada. So I assume you're Canadian. Is the vantage point of Stargate that America controls this wonderful technology, this portal to not only other planets but other galaxies? Is the vantage point like, of course, America should unilaterally have this?
It's the American military. Absolutely, I think everybody sees it that way. I mean, and it's not wrong. You've got Americans spend way more money on their military than anyone else, and
we're ready to fight half the globe based on our military spending. It's about 48% of global defense is just my country.
So the Stargate itself, actually, Mika, maybe you can speak more to how much electricity it actually uses, but it is said to take up an awful lot of energy to start this thing, to connect it to connect this wormhole to another planet.
Yeah.
And there's one comment that one of the generals makes in it saying, do you know how much it costs just to keep the lights on around here? And of course, referring to the fact that, or to keep this thing on, to keep the Stargate active is so expensive. And this is all, a top secret organization. They don't it's all money that's been hidden from the American people themselves. So that's another reason I think that Stargate is a cool show, is because it's one of those things that could theoretically be happening right now.
It's contemporary. It's not in the not too distant future. It is parallel to us.
It's not an alternate. Right. And it's not an alternate reality or something like that. Of course, there are alternate reality episodes and such. But the fact that it's present day is really fun because it could be happening right now. And it's actually in a military base that does exist today. It's, where NORAD is in Colorado Springs, called Cheyenne Mountain Complex. And you can see this on Google. You can, see the satellite imagery. And this is a real place. And they actually make reference to it in the show. They say, NORAD just called us from upstairs kind of thing. And so.
And they actually had to do and get military consulting in order to be able to use all those exterior shots they do.
Oh, wow.
That is, they had to go through, get approval, things like having military style haircuts and have ponytails to pull the hair back for the women characters with long hair, all of that. It's a whole thing.
Mika,
there are some actual military members, right? I think there are a few characters who are in real life at the time were, real secretary of whatever that were actually on the show as themselves. Yeah. So that's kind of fun too.
Oh, really?
Was really, really big into guest stars.
Wait, so they'd have like the assistant director, or I don't know, military, like the assistant joint chief for the Navy would just pop in for an episode?
Up into Vancouver.
Literally, yeah.
The visas would be super special to do this.
Well, I know that because like an episode that I really enjoyed, Mika, you suggested that I watch Brainstorm, which has. I was most excited about Dave Foley because I love news radio, and I think Dave Foley is a brilliant actor. So I was really excited he was in there. But it also had specifically Bill Nye and Neil deGrasse Tyson, probably at kind of their peak or ascent in pop culture. It was my guess based on the dating of it. But like I was like, oh, okay, they're throwing in some well-known public scientists, and they had like a clear reference to Stephen Hawking. Although I assume that was not Stephen Hawking in the episode, but there was a guy in a wheelchair with a like a motorized voice. You see him quipping and that kind of thing. So I was like, oh, they're making some definite cameo drops in here.
Yeah, so this was an episode. It was supposed to be Sci-Fi was trying to have a green week, and Stargate is the only actual show that played along, and nobody else did it. So we were the only ones who did this like climate change episode. Yeah. And the concept of the episode was, what if we solve climate change by shuttling all of our excess heat to a parallel dimension through a wormhole? But oopsies, the wormhole got stuck because it turns out when you have a bunch of physicists solving big, huge global problems, things go wrong very quickly. So this episode thrills and delights me because, first of all, you have a science conference in the middle of a desert in formal wear.
Yeah. Standard stuff. As a civilian, Mika, I assume that scientists put on tuxedos and cocktail dresses once or twice a month to drink champagne with Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye. That's just your jet set in life.
I will say that my performance wear when I work conventions is actually ball gowns with long gloves, but this is like partly aesthetics, partly because then I'm wearing gloves and get sick less often.
Smart.
Yeah, it's also the petticoats give me a little bit of extra room so people don't crowd me too much. It's all very strategic aesthetics. But this episode was really, really fun because they didn't warn me who their guest stars were. I'd worked with them on the script, but they didn't tell me about the guest stars until I showed up on set. And I show up, and my boss grabs me, tucks me in behind him, and like pulls me across the entire set. We walk up to this group of people. He grabs me, pushes me forward, and goes, "We have a scientist!" and like shoves me into the circle. Then wiggles his hands at me, going, "Go on, do science at them." And this is how
like
I
you
met
should
Bill
pull out
Nye
a beaker
and Neil deGrasse Tyson.
I like do science at them as if you would like have a beaker in your pocket and just pull it out and be like, presto, and like you'd change salt into gold or something.
We talked about
I gotta say, I gotta say, Stargate is pretty good for the continuity of their science, right? Like, I don't think, like, of course there are issues, but for the most part, I think there are a lot of other series that have a lot more to complain about in terms of just like the logic behind the science. And Stargate's one of those cool ones, I think, where it's easy to find a flaw in anything, of course, that doesn't exist, like wormholes. I mean, sure, maybe they exist, but like certainly we haven't, manifested them at this level. So to see that this sort of still holds up even today. I think the worst is that some of the computers that were used in the 90s, of course, they're like, we have a supercomputer, and, and you can see
it looks like a giant television set.
Yeah, and when it's booting up, you can see it's got 6,000 kilobytes of RAM or something that's just like ridiculous low amount that's, in my headphones now. So so that's, I think, the worst part that's been dated was sort of that equipment. But for the rest of it, the science, I think everybody is pretty on board with. And I don't think there have been too many online posts that I've seen of people criticizing your drawings there, Mika, of all the equations. So.
There's so much stuff. My favorite is the person who accused me of not knowing what I was talking about. And I'm like, that's literally my handwriting. I am canon. Like, everything you're arguing about is from my notes. But that consistency was a huge, big deal for us. So we did things like the particular formulation of the type of wormhole, the type of traversable wormhole is a specific type that we use consistently for seasons on end. And that we do things like we use the ancient alphabet inside of it. It is like the variables in some of our equations, like solve for X, except for it's solve for weird little squiggly line with multiple dots. But that weird little squiggly line
solve for the Orion formula
means the same thing year after year after year after year after year, which means, and this is where we're going to tie back into Reddit, we had an article I wrote for IO9 one year about a cryptography problem that was hidden in Stargate Universe. And I posted some more screenshots than I usually, than you can see in the episodes. And people on Reddit got super into it and started trying to solve it. And because I'd embedded spoilers for future episodes in the background equations, because we were filming out of order at that point.
Jackson's a Cylon.
Actually figured some things out and privately emailed me being like, is this what it is? And I'm like, yes, it is. Go on. So yeah, the very, very few people complain about the equations or the actual concepts in it. And you can actually find a lot of plot hints, particularly Stargate Universe, once they gave me my own set piece. They hit this point where they're like, so the concept of Stargate Universe is everybody is stuck on a ship that is drifting, an alien ship that's drifting through space on a mission that they don't know what it is. It's a perfect quarantine show because the crew is trapped in quarantine and they're going through all the we're stuck inside problems you've got now. And they went without supplies.
Wait, hold on. So are they dealing with cabin fever and things like that?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah. They totally are. And they're running into issues of we're bored, want to get it on, and then the fallout drama from that, it's all there. But they didn't have enough paper.
I'm interested.
Pre-stock supplies.
You should tell us about Can you tell us about the sort of medical stuff that was, because there are a few pandemics, right, that happen not in Universe specifically, but just across the series. There are, I think there's an episode even called Influenza, and there's a sort of an alien life force from the Ori, they're called. It's one of the villains in the later season who comes out, and their whole thing is making a pandemic on a planet. I'm wondering if you had much to do with sort of how that might evolve and how that looks compared to today.
So unlike most physicists, I try and stay in my lane, which means I do all of the physics, the geology, the explosions, the math, the cryptography. But as soon as you hit medical, there's another person who does things like make sure that the x-rays are right side up. So on that particular chunk of things, I would help with, okay, so what are how can we improvise the energy requirements of our ZPM to actually be able to connect the gate, and how can we MacGyver this together? But what the epidemiology is going to be and what the spread is going to be would actually be the next science consultant, which again, very rare for sci-fi to have multiple consultants like this.
Yeah, I know. I'm very impressed because I feel like, and I say this as an ethnic Star Trek fan. Like I am a deep Star Trek fan. I'm not taking the swings at it. But there are a lot of episodes where it feels like they write the plot and then they just put in brackets like tech term. And then they just hand it off to somebody. They're like, tachyons.
We've done that in Stargate, but in the best possible way. So there was an episode in Stargate Universe where they wrote the episode and then came to me and said, we need something in the universe, like an external astrophysical big baddie that kills everybody every 22 minutes. And I went, okay. They said, we're thinking pulsar. And I'm going, okay, so a pulsar, which is a feeding black hole that sends out jets on either end out the poles of high energy, incredibly deadly particles that whirls around like a lighthouse of death, except for it does this on milliseconds. And if you slow it down to 22 minutes, the electromagnetic field and lighthouse of death effect is going to be like holding fridge magnets and doing cartwheels. Technically, you can detect it, but it's not going to kill anybody. So we had to come up with an idea of, all right, they want a pulsar, they want 22 minutes. Those are my fixed points. What can I finagle in between? And I looked. I didn't find anything. And I finally went, all right, fine. What we're going to do is we're going to have a starving pulsar. It's right on the edge, just on the boundary of being quiescent and active. And then we're going to give it another star, like a big, huge, red giant or something like that. That's in a tight orbit around it that comes by every 22 minutes. And the starving pulsar grabs that gas and dust, gobbles it down, gets just above the mass limit, activates, kill, death, lighthouse of doom, and then the feeder star comes away, it uses up that mass, it starves out, it goes quiet again. And so we did this. And then 3 years later, astronomers found a system like this in real life.
Wow.
We did it first.
How cool.
You beat the universe to the punch.
Yes.
Good job.
So it was totally we just need it was literally little brackets, insert astrophysical big baddie here, but it worked and we got to do something super fun, and I totally have bragging rights for the rest of my life being yeah.
I hope at the very least you get to go to one of these fancy galas and call the thing a lighthouse of death. That's a great phrase. I hope that you get to trademark that.
At the very least, you did predict it in a way, right? So, and I think that's something to be said about Stargate science in general, is that, you were mentioning Star Trek, and of course, there's no sci-fi show that can't be, compared to Star Trek in some way, just as an archetype. But the thing that I like that's similar to Star Trek is that it's very episodic. In Star Trek, they go to a new planet every day, or every episode there's sort of a new culture to deal with. And Stargate has the same sort of setup, but instead of being a ship that they fly there, they can use this portal called Stargate that they can go to these other planets. So you still get this writing freedom to come up with these new ideas all the time of, okay, this is the culture, or this is the science, or here's the device, or whatever that is. But at the same time, it's different from Star Trek because in Star Trek, they always sort of, there's this assumption that the characters themselves know the universe and how it's working and all of this. Whereas in Stargate, they're sort of discovering how the Stargate itself works. They don't know from the beginning how this thing works. And in fact, a good portion of the beginning of the series is them figuring out how to get their dialing computer to connect to it properly, trying to translate the the fact that there's been this stellar drift over millennia, and so all of the gates have been sort of spread out a little further than the original addresses to them, and how to compensate for that, and
they're coming in from behind technologically too, right? So aptly in Star Trek, they frequently encounter civilizations that are more advanced than them, but for the most part, the Federation's doing pretty well. And a lot of the civilizations,
and conceptually they can understand it. It's not magic to them.
Right. They're like, oh, okay, yeah, that must be some sort of transwarp species, right? And then you get into like Star Wars, which my personal theory is I think the Star Wars universe is living in a dark age. Like I think they've already had a technological collapse and they don't know how to make new stuff. But that's a side note. That said, though, it's all very blasé to people in Star Wars. Star Wars is filled with like trash and like scuff marks and things of like, oh, where are you from? You're from Tatooine? Ugh. Like Star Wars, there's nothing novel within that universe. So within Stargate, they're coming from like we're like, pre-literate villagers who've stumbled onto this. Maybe that's too drastic, but we're coming from we're entering the sort of galactic political warfare sphere as an underdog because we've inherited this technology rather than developed it, and we're having to discover everything anew.
Yeah, so the other thing about that, too, is that in Star Trek, I've noticed that whenever there's a new type of technology that they want to sort of integrate into the show, it's almost a one-off thing that they don't get to use anymore. Whereas in Stargate, over the 10 years of Stargate SG-1, they go from having basically nothing and just some P-90s that they realize, okay, we need to get armor-piercing bullets because all of our enemies have this thick, metallic armor on them. So they have some sort of things that they can do as Earthlings, as people of Earth, the Tauri, as they refer to it in Stargate. But at the same time, as the series develops, they do inherit the technology. They create ships by the end of it. They have allies who help them, similar to the Vulcans, I guess, help the people of Earth in Star Trek. But in general, in Star Trek, you have to kind of go to a new series before there's an advancement in technology. They don't get transwarp one day and then all of a sudden everybody can do transwarp. They sort of use it temporarily and then it's gone. Whereas in Stargate, when they get an alien weapon, like a staff weapon, or there's this cool laser handgun called a Zat Nicotel that the Goa'uld, an enemy, has, and it sort of stuns and also kills. And at one point it made things disappear, but then they kind of backtracked on this. Mika, do you know about that? What happened there? So originally this weapon was you would shoot once and it would stun. You would shoot twice and it would kill. So if you got hit by the electricity twice, it would kill you. And then if you hit somebody the third time, they would evaporate, like to completely vaporize, like a Star Trek, high.
What a tidy weapon! Because bullets certainly don't work that way.
But they sort of backtracked on this. Yeah, so they sort of went back on it and they stopped doing it, right? They thought it was weird, I guess.
Things that happened in like the first few seasons of Stargate SG-1 that kind of got calibrated out. It's the same reason why, like, in the beginning, all the wormhole travel resulted in everybody coming out covered in frost. And then they're like, let's just fix that because it turns out it's eating up a lot of our visual effects budget and that's really inconvenient.
Yeah, but they explained that one a little bit, right? Exactly. They literally calibrated their dialing computer, though, right? Like, that was an in-universe explanation, whereas... Later, there were other stuff that they didn't really explain. It just stopped doing it.
Like,
right?
It's the fact that calibration actually made it as a plot point kind of delights my little scientist heart. In my daily life, I work with disasters all the time. I'm very cheerful about doom, and I'm trying to keep everybody from dying unnecessarily.
Great, thank you. You seem chipper and competent, which is exactly what we need.
So the thing that I really, really enjoy about this in the Stargate context is I run a science fiction panel when I go to conventions about, like, let's be a Stargate or a Star Trek landing party, and I'll gather a bunch of scientists up and we'll go through episodes and be like, all right, you're in orbit. Here's the situation. What do you do? And inevitably the scientists are like, send a robot. The robot does, and then we're like, yep, leave. Quarantine the planet. We're done. What I appreciate about Stargate is that we have all of these little robots who go through first, where they're like, yeah, we sent the little robot through first. It's Earth-like conditions, tested out the air. Everything is cool and fun and dandy. And, like, they'll just barricade planets and be like, yeah, this is a bad idea. Let's just never go back. Lock that out of the dialing computer. You cannot enter the address anymore.
Go ahead, AJ.
Yeah, They also, well, just to say there are, you're right. There's also, so they have the MALP, right, which is this giant military, like 4-wheeler kind of thing that goes through with a big arm. And everybody kind of says, well, couldn't you have just kind of, chucked a sensor through and then, but instead they have this like huge multi-million-dollar expensive machine. And then, but later they do have MALPs, right? Or like an aerial, or sorry, they have a UAV, right? I think it's unmanned aerial vehicle that, so they literally launch these things through
they get a drone.
Stargate and it flies around on, it's a drone. It's literally a drone, but that was before drones were cool.
Right.
So
they were just remote controlled helicopters back then. Yeah, we didn't have the term.
Well, these are helicopters, like RC planes that they fly around. So I appreciate that. But then in Universe, they have an even cooler thing, right? Maybe you can tell us about that. It's like a sphere. What is that?
So they were like little spherical cameras. They're the alien tech again, because Stargate is all about scavenging somebody else's technology and hacking it together very poorly to be able to use it yourself. So this one is, they had like little baseball-sized floating cameras, and they kept finding them in boxes and being like, oh look, there's more in the supply. Oh no, we destroyed some. We're running low. Oh, we haven't found any more. How do we charge these again? And they also allowed for the opportunity to have extra web content by having the cameras go around on the ship. But they allowed to be able to explore some of these other worlds. I also like that for Stargate Universe, when everyone's trapped in this ship going through space and they didn't plan and don't have all of the supplies they'd wanted, they did like an emergency evacuation where you just grab the nearest stuff, chuck it through the wormhole, and you're like, good enough! Because of that...
And they don't have access to the bridge at the beginning either, right? Like, they can't control this ship. It's on its own.
They're like marooned on the ship, and they're not even flying it.
Oh, yeah. The ship is doing itself. It's been around for like thousands of years. It's been flying around. They don't even know which galaxy they're in.
Yeah, and the ship is on autopilot, and they're just like, so what up? And, like, they start off, the entirety of Stargate Universe starts off where they're like, we have no idea how to turn on the air. We're all going to suffocate. And that was a super, super fun call, because I got it, like, in the middle of summer. They're like, so we're going to be filming this. How would you build an air purifier using rocks? I'm like, well, interesting you should ask this question. Do I get to come with you? Unfortunately, I did not get to go to the White Sands Desert, but the whole reason why they ended up filming at White Sands and all of that is because I'm like, okay, so you need dehydrated lake beds, and you can take out the lime, and here's how we do carbon scrubbing on a geological timescale on Earth, and what you can do to, like, do it on the planet. And they got it all through, and they did it all, and then in the script, it is exactly 100% backwards. Like, the equations are running in the wrong direction. And I'm just like, oh, so close. Like, if this was an exam for my students, it'd be solid B+ work. Because you clearly understand all of the concepts. You just have the arrow in the wrong way.
It's funny how similar that opening is to Stargate Atlantis, right? So the premiere of the other spin-off, Stargate Atlantis, which came before Stargate Universe, was that, from Earth, they went to Atlantis, and Atlantis was underwater at the time, and it was starting to flood. It was on its last legs. It has this shield that's protecting it from the ocean, and it just slowly starts collapsing, and there are rooms that start filling up. And eventually, basically just to say that it's pretty much the same opening if you think about it, right? There's this panic to, how are we even going to survive now that we're here? We can't go back. So that's kind of cool.
All of this seems like good quarantine material. I agree. Oh, yeah. All of this seems apropos for that. I'll toss out a couple more themes that I think might play out in it. Although again, with just a 6-episode scattering that I'm looking at, clearly I'm anecdotal rather than really getting into the nuts and bolts of the series. It seems to me that kind of science versus mythology is a big part of the Stargate universe. At least starting with a film, the film premise is that it's kind of like Chariot of the Gods with a plot. It's the idea that the ancient Egyptian gods were not mythical, rather they were just aliens that we're gods. You should get gold for us.
Right.
And
Children of the Gods is the name of the episode. Yeah. But it's true. They have right. So it starts off with Dr. Daniel Jackson giving a speech to a room that's basically empty, right? And people are sort of heckling him because he believes that the ancient pyramids were used as landing pads for an alien species called the Goa'uld, which he doesn't know at the time that they're called Goa'uld, I don't think. But this is the whole premise of the show, right? Is that there are these people who back, I think, between World War I and World War II, they were digging around, archaeologists, and they found this ring, and it's made of a substance they've never seen before. And so they can use this to eventually, they figured out in the movie, which was made in 1994, so it's pretty dated now. Dr. Daniel Jackson himself was the one who uncovered the final piece, which was a symbol for Earth, which was actually representative of a pyramid and, people worshiping the sun. We have one sun. And so I definitely agree with you that there's all this mythology. And in fact, for the first probably 5 or more seasons, it's all about Egyptian gods who were aliens. They were body snatchers called the Goa'uld, who took over a human's body, and they adopted this role of the pharaoh running the town, or the city or the planet eventually. And they always, they enslaved their people, and the entire galaxy is, on a whole, they're quite unsophisticated. Most people have been indentured slaves for the past millennia, and they don't actually have much advanced technology. And when humans come, we actually are the most advanced, because I guess back in Egypt, we scared off Ra, the main guy, and then he ends up in the movie. Well, I won't spoil it for people, but something happens where Ra is no longer the ruler of a planet.
I'm going to make a judgment call. We can spoil that element, given that Stargate came out.
Yeah, well, obviously he dies. The first person the first one of these Goa'uld that they end up finding and killing is a pharaoh, Ra.
Well, he's kind of the galactic emperor, right? And then it was like in the film they kill effectively the galactic emperor, and then in the series there's sort of the civilization breaks down, and it's now all the regional warlords of the Goa'uld trying to seize power.
Egyptian gods, right? You've got like everyone from and some of them are sort of found on Earth again. They have these ancient bottles that they open up, and the Goa'uld are a snake-like creature that goes in through either your mouth at the back of your neck or and they attach themselves to your brainstem. So they're kind of the epitome of a body snatcher. And, you're not the first or the last sci-fi show to deal with this concept of having a regular human's body taken over. But they definitely go a long way with it. And there's some sad parts, too. You realize that, of course, the human host is a victim to this alien. And I think Apophis, the serpent god, eventually they capture him, and they remove the symbiote that's called the Goa'uld, and the host underneath is speaking ancient Egyptian, and this poor man has lived for thousands of years enslaving people, torturing people, and just generally being a really evil being. And now he has to live with, he dies right away, because now this, he's been alive for thousands of years, but just to say, it's a pretty horrible thing.
He's like a passenger. Like his consciousness exists, but it's subordinate to that of the.
As if you're in the brain, like you experience it like a dream, but you have no control over your body. But the implication is that the host is alive the whole time. And in fact, it sort of reminds me today of when there's these conspiracy theories and things. And one of the things the Goa'uld says is that nothing of the host survives. When they take over a body, it's theirs now. There's no use trying to get rid of the Goa'uld symbiote out of their head, because the host underneath is dead anyway. And as soon as you take me out, it won't be there anymore. We find out that this is just propaganda, and it's not true. The host does survive. So there are a few cases where eventually they are able to take the Goa'uld out, and the human is back to, as normal a person as they can be. Well, they have PTSD usually, but,
Do they play around with the body snatcher element of part of what makes the invasion of the body snatchers such a scary film or engaging film is the fact that you don't necessarily know who's been body snatched. There's an element of I think Battlestar Galactica does that fantastically with Cylons, where you don't know who the enemy incursionary force is. Is it the same thing where Goa'uld will take over someone,
and they take over their memories as well, right? So they can completely adopt the entire life of the host, and you wouldn't even know it. And this happens in a few episodes. And eventually, what happens is that the people who did used to be a Goa'uld, or they did used to have one in them, in some cases they can sort of sense that another person is, because there's this element in their blood called naquita. There's a whole subplot here, but basically they do start to be able to detect when somebody has been taken over by a host. And this is actually a kind of a constant science theme as well, where, they'll have, for instance, they meet an enemy called the Ritu in one episode, which are out of phase. You can't really see them. You need some special devices to see them. and they take over the base. And after that episode, they make reference, actually. Samantha Carter says, every time somebody comes through the gate now, we're gonna flash this noise or whatever, some field is going to envelop the gate room to reveal anybody who might be out of phase. And they slowly start adding these types of precautions every time somebody comes back through the gate. So that's kind of a fun build-up.
Yeah.
I really do appreciate that this concept of culture and science don't need to be in conflict is kind of embedded in the core of Stargate. So every time you've got an off-world team, it consists of 4 people, and they generally fill the role of leader, soldier, cultural liaison, which could be an anthropologist. In SG-1, it turns into like aliens who know the local territory for Stargate Atlantis.
Okay.
And the scientist. And that's your core 4-person team. That was not a really common combination to have at the time when Stargate first started. But it makes for some interesting stories because you've always got that inherent mix of perspectives on what is going on. And you've got that constant push-pull of how exactly are you going to make decisions. It gets even more interesting when we were saying before, Stargate SG-1 starts off with military leadership, but with Stargate Atlantis, it moves to a civilian leadership. And then for Stargate Universe, there is no clear leadership, and there's this enormous conflict between the military and the civilians of who should actually be running the program, which turns into like a multi-season conflict.
That sounds that is really interesting, and I think you're right about that, because like Star Trek, it's typically a group of scientists beaming down to a planet. There are episodes that have a military element to it, particularly in Deep Space Nine, but TNG, Voyager, TOS, they're primarily scientists going down to scope things out. And then Battlestar Galactica, they are very much military. There's like a scientist in Battlestar Galactica. Everybody else is military or civilian to some extent, but like military is the overwhelming thing. You're seeing it from the perspective of a battleship, right? That's interesting that they would have a scientist, a cultural liaison, which is great because that means I finally have some role in this universe that I could conceivably do. Of like, I know stuff about. I'm an arts and sciences guy. I could do the arts and sciences thing.
Yeah, there are people who document stuff too. There's kind of like a journalistic aspect to. There's a few episodes where there's like a documentary that they're doing so that when the Stargate program eventually is revealed, then they'll have some sort of record of the heroism that has occurred over the past few years. But if we're talking about culture, I guess we can't really leave out the discussion about language and the speech that people use on these various planets. So normally in shows, they'll have a universal translator. Right. They'll have some sort of
Babelfish or something. Yeah.
Some type of, I think Farscape has
protocol
like
droid in Star Wars.
Right. In Farscape, they have like a biological thing that goes into your brainstem and it does the translation in your head for you. And, so there's always some sort of way. But with Stargate, they actually don't. After the original opening with the movie, they have to learn this Abydonian language that is basically ancient Egyptian. So Dr. Daniel Jackson helps to sort of decode that and figure that out. And those people always somehow have this Egyptian accent. So those people definitely have another language. But then as we go through pretty well every other episode, everybody just speaks regular American English, which is quite strange and was definitely one of the most, so actually, I noticed back, I was mentioning before, about 10 years ago.
Wait, hold on. They don't even, because usually what we do in Hollywood films is if the aliens are smarter than us, we make them British. And if they're...
Yeah,
they don't even do that? Just everybody's straight up American?
No, they're just American English. I think there might have been a few more like the ancients, like the people from like the Atlanteans or sort of the mid-Atlantic accent where it's like long ago in a...
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Good to see you again. Come on in.
For the most part, everything's just... Yeah. So, and then...
have a lot of British accents in British Columbia, which means that when we're doing all of our extras and all the people who we're hiring a character, an actor, but they're not going to be a reoccurring role. So we don't really want to bring like the whole visa mess across the border. Right. We have to look hometown to do it. Uh-huh. So who exactly is living in Vancouver? And our population, we have an enormous Hong Kong population. We have a ginormous Ukrainian population, but we do not have a lot of British or Scottish.
Because they always go to Australia.
Years.
I used to live in Scotland, and when the Brits leave and go to another country, they invariably go to Australia or Florida for whatever purpose. Like British people don't want to go to another cold climate when they immigrate. That's just they rarely do that.
Of Australians here. Like if you want to know what our local accent is, well, to start with, it's almost mine, but I've got too much Californian twang in it. But like our local actor base is all Canadian, American, maybe some Australian, maybe some Ukrainian or Hong Kong. No Brits.
So it's funny because they actually do have people from these cultures that you're talking about, right? Like they have in Atlantis in particular, they have Zelenka, and he's, I think he's Czech, right? So he has an accent, and they have a few Russians, and they have Scottish, of course, with Dr. Bennett. Anyway, so just to say, like, it's not as though they're not aware of the fact that like other countries exist or that there are other sort of backgrounds of speaking, but then they don't actually ever have people speaking their native languages of their planet, right? So when they go to meet a new culture, they're always just American English, and at best, you have these kind of earlier episodes where they communicate a little differently.
Is there an explanation for that? Like, do we just all happen to speak the Queen's English?
No, I mean, at the beginning of this show, I remember being, like a teenager and going online and trying to find out, like, well, what's the story here? Like, what's the actual canon reason for this? And on MGM's website for Stargate, it was a very basic website, but it did have some FAQs. And one of the questions was, well, why does everybody on every planet speak English? And the response from the producers seemed to be basically just that they didn't feel that this story was an interesting part of their 42-minute episode. They didn't want to spend a quarter of it learning the language and then having this whole language barrier. They wanted to...
Yeah. Every episode is a 10-minute montage of Jackson learning a new language and scribbling things on a board and like pointing at a circle and going circle. Like, yeah, I get why they didn't want to have to do that every time.
It's like having calibration happening. You only need the calibration episode once, and then you just move on.
Right. Yeah.
Right. But they didn't even do that with this, right? There's no canon explanation. They didn't say, all of a sudden, normally there's some type of small reference to why everybody can understand each other, right? Or, in this, they just didn't do it. They just didn't address it. Any alien they met, they would speak English, and that was it. And nobody, I guess, we just all suspend our disbelief. I gotta say, we enjoy the show with that.
Speaking as an American here, there's also a very American way of looking at the universe.
It is.
Of like, we won. You should be speaking English. I'm here in France. Why isn't everybody accommodating me?
It's just the Milky Way. Also the Pegasus Galaxy.
Yeah,
which is
Pegasus Galaxy.
They also speak English.
You guys would be speaking German if it weren't for us. So, like, buck up and learn English, Pegasus Galaxy. I'll go back before I forget. Mika, I wanted to say I really enjoyed the Brainstorm episode you referenced earlier with Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye. What I found interesting about that episode, what I liked about it's not even like an analogy for climate change. They're talking about climate change. They're talking about solutions for climate change. What I liked about it, what I thought was a really smart play in the episode, was the kind of the more reductivist and cartoonish version of climate change episodes that I've seen in other science fiction elements is there's the scientist and the idiot is like, it's not happening. I love money, and then it's trying to convince the evil, greedy person to come out of it. In that episode, the guy that's the most obstinate is not like putting his head in the sand. He's a businessman who's funding this project to try and save the world. And he's like, look, if we topple this whole thing, we're going to lose this very valuable technology that could help save us from climate change. And so it's more of an ethical balance between, do we save the people in the building, do we save Bill Nye and Neil deGrasse Tyson and get them out, or do we like risk everybody's life in order to have this technology? And I thought that was a much more clever way of doing it than just kind of having like, the idiot we don't like versus the smart people. I thought that was a clever play.
So I need to give you a little bit of local context. In British Columbia, we are home to one of the largest unsanctioned geological engineering experiments with climate change, pulled off by a millionaire who just decided to go for it.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. So a couple years back, a millionaire decided to do iron seeding in the ocean near Haida Gwaii, which is like northern British Columbia, with the idea that this would feed plankton, and then that would feed the fish, and you go all the way up the food chain on that, and yay, magic.
Okay.
But because, millionaire, not scientist, they didn't do anything like get ethical approval. They misrepresented the project to the local people in order to deceive them about it. They didn't do controlled measurements. So we have no idea what the before was, much less what the impact of the after was. And this is just a thing that happened that we found out afterwards with no ability to be like, wait, no, excuse me, what? And I think that's kind of shaped our view of geological engineering and climate change a little bit.
Interesting. Okay.
Like, maybe there should be some ethical oversight here. Maybe we shouldn't experiment with the only planet we're living on. Maybe we should do this in a more controlled manner, which is, I think, all.
Also, we shouldn't be at the whim of millionaires to solve this problem, right? I think that in itself, the government should be.
In theory, if Bill Gates went, guys, I've thought about this, and we're just going to pump a bunch of tiny mirrors into the atmosphere to cool off the planet by 10 degrees, you would go, hold on, let's think about all of the possible outcomes of building a giant solar shade. What if this backfires? That kind of thing.
I currently receive a very large number of death threats on a regular basis for objecting to very poorly thought out plans by extremely rich men.
Wow.
So I don't really want to open myself up to more of that.
Sure.
By name and name,
sorry.
This is a thing that happens on a regular basis.
Mika, I didn't realize we were treading into death threat territory. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bait you in that.
I'm a woman in science in public on the internet. I have received at least one death or rape threat every day for the last many years.
Jeez,
this is just a part of my job. So nice and cheerful. Moving on.
No, I gotta say, that puts my life in perspective, because I'm like, a stranger I never met was mean to me on Twitter. it's nobody's giving me death threats. I'm just I'll keep that in mind next time. I'm like, gosh, the internet's mad.
So one thing that I was really delighted by when I first started being open about the fact I was Stargate scientist is I was scared that I get mobbed by angry fans being like, well, what about this? Or let me challenge you on that. And instead, I've had that happen maybe once a year. And for the most part, it's people who are just really excited that they can share their joy in something. And I've had so many people come up to me and be like, they apologize. I don't know science, but I really love this thing. And then they talk to me about an element of Stargate and they go through all of the details of it. And I'm like, okay, so, well, all of the facts, like the ZPMs and things like that in Stargate are fiction. The scientific process is still there. We do the practice of science really well, and you've just described how you do observations, conduct an experiment, have analyze the results, how you modify your hypothesis to match your observations and come to a new conclusion. You're doing all of the steps of science. So please stop telling me you're bad at science. You just learned it in a different context.
Well, I think you've probably been quite inspiring to a lot of young people who've sort of grown up and decided that, okay, yeah, this is what I want to do. So I think that's really cool. And furthermore, it's nice that the main character my favorite character is Samantha Carter, who is the scientist on the show, the smartest person that exists, basically. And to me, that's also nice to see that there's this strong, independent woman who knows a lot. She knows more than her colleagues, and they never sort of look down on her. There's one weird sort of hiccup in the first episode where she makes this weird comment, but that they sort of go back on, and they immediately turn her into she is the thing holding it together, in my opinion. And she saves the day almost every episode just with her science knowledge and her ability to execute. And she's not dainty or something. She's a military woman.
Based on my cursory viewing of the series, she seems to be the most emotionally stable and resilient character.
Yep.
O'Neill has lost a child. He's gone through a divorce. Seems to have the hots for Carter. Can't quite come out and say it. Doesn't really have the emotional chops necessary to do it. Jackson has a kind of passive aggressive thing going on where he's not really you can count on him in a pinch, but up until then he's going to get. Whereas Carter seems to be just very straightforward and adult.
Yeah, and I don't want to say that she's she's not an empty soul. She's not a cold, hard woman.
No,
she does have an awful lot of character development with regards to it's kind of tragic too for her. She does have a relationship with somebody who is not part of the Stargate program for a while. His name is Pete, the character, and he's a cop. And she really believes that, this guy would get it. He understands like the how profound this role that I have is. So it's kind of sad when she's not able to make her relationship work based a lot on the fact that she's not able to be honest about her actual job, which she continues to have a cover story of doing deep space telemetry for the military, which also comes to light when she has with her relationship with her father, Jacob Carter, who is also in the military. And there's one moment where he's basically on his deathbed and he says, hey, on my, I've gotten you this chance to go into NASA. You can finally go to space. And little does he know that she's already been to several planets. It's not something that is really on her radar anymore because she's already doing something that, again, is so profound and is literally defending the planet from aliens that her father doesn't even know exist. So to me, that's another thing that, and it says he's got his terminal cancer. This poor man is dying, just wants to see his daughter fulfill her dreams, where she's not just fulfilled them, she's well surpassed them. And now it's not about her anymore. She's a true American hero, an Earth hero. So that's neat. I really appreciate that as a, they made her character that portrayed in that way, that she's a human, but is also extremely knowledgeable and holds the team together.
Nice.
We see similar sort of competency when we move on to like Stargate Atlantis, and Elizabeth Weir is the civilian leader, the scientist leader for the expedition, and also has this, like, I love it. Stargate has a very high proportion of extremely competent women in science who also are extremely emotionally stable. It got a little like funny / awkward the longer I stayed with the show, because writers write what they know. And if I'm the scientist that they know, suddenly slightly fictionalized versions of my quirks are starting to show up on set. And by the time we got to Universe, there's a character who has multiple PhDs, and I don't have a PhD at all. I have a master's. But she's got multiple PhDs where each one is a research project that I did in real life. And they're all just like, take this project, amp them up. Congratulations, you are now that scientist. Or like,
right. And which isn't to say there aren't problems. Like, there are still some issues with like some of the portrayal of some of these characters with regard to just like race, gender, etc. So like, I don't think we can give Stargate as a whole a pass, but I think they do a lot more right than they get wrong. So
there's also, I will give warning that Stargate Universe does have some very thorny consent issues that are not addressed in the way that I personally would have chosen. And this comes down to that whole body swapping thing again, except for this time. It's consensual body swapping, but they do not come up with good rules for what is acceptable to do in somebody else's body.
Well, so when you say body swapping, is this the snake aliens that were referenced earlier, or is this a different thing?
No, this is between humans, between one's stuck in quarantine and one's back on Earth.
And they can like download their brains into their minds into the other person's body, so they can get like a vacation or something.
Pretty much,
exactly.
It's like a big plot point thing that it's more conflict. It's more conflict in storytelling, and also a way to have some terrestrial episodes and still stay connected with all of our guest stars from prior seasons.
Yeah, I got to say, that seems like a thing that would require etiquette, because like, were I to go on Airbnb, I would set some rules of what you can do in my apartment. I'd be like, have fun. If you bring somebody home, like, I'm going to change the sheets regardless. That's okay. No smoking.
Relationships in them, though. Like, it's even worse than that. They go and have like relations with their wife that they used to have, and all of these things. So. And they get into fist fights. Like, it's like you wake up and your body has been beaten up and you don't know why, because you just swapped bodies for a week or a day or whatever period it is.
Yeah, no fist fights, no smoking, make good decisions involving protection regarding sex. There's a lot of things that I would have in my...
I'm glad you brought up this consent issue, because this is it is kind of creepy in a way. I mean, not in a way, definitely creepy, but then also it's like strangely fantastical. Like, people almost like dream of being able to do that, right? You're like, oh, well, if I'm in that person's body, I'm going to look at myself naked. And that in itself isn't necessarily like a consent with another person thing. It's like a consent of your own body. Like, obviously you need to use the bathroom and stuff too. So it's not even like you're going to get away from it. So I think that's a great point that you brought up. I hadn't even considered that on my list of problematic themes, but that's
Can they download into other genders, or do all the males go into male bodies? Okay, because I'd be fascinated to see what that's like. I'd like that would make good episode fodder, just to be like, okay, like stuff's a little different now.
I mean, especially if you're both open about it and you're like, okay, yeah, let's try it. Sounds fun. I mean, I guess, but that would be consent. Right? Yeah, they don't talk about that. They just do it. So. Yeah. So I want to say if we can, like, finally, I mean, or not finally, whatever. I'll talk all day.
We're going to wrap up here pretty quick. Go for it.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say that as a young person growing up with Stargate, one of the things that we got to watch through this series as well, the fact that it's on for so many years means that you kind of got to see TV change and like cinema in general change. And it's I believe it's
the longest running sci-fi series after Doctor Who, I think. Like, it actually outpaces Star Trek. I mean, by individual series.
Right. I think it's like
continuous sci-fi series in North America.
Continuous.
For sure.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So, I mean, 10 years of Stargate SG-1 is I guess, what gets that title. And then, of course, there are these two spin-offs. Stargate Atlantis was 5 years, overlapping a little. And then Stargate Universe was 3 years. Plus, there's a couple movies. And, so definitely a long one. So, but just to say that, like, you can see throughout, the aspect ratio changes. It's where we started moving to HD. So I've always found the sort of the cinematography of the show stay consistent, yet also keep up with the times in that sense. So I think that's something that Stargate did really well. And it was in kind of a difficult time, right? Like, you can't just like switch midway through your aspect ratio. Now you've got letter bars for people who have 4:3 TVs. And it just, I think that's something that should be noted as something that they did really well, is that they kept up with this genre that is cinema and TV and sci-fi in general. So.
Well, so I'll wrap it up here in a second. Before we leave, any other themes that you think the series explored that it just strike your mind? It's okay if not. I can just cut it off there. But I wondered if there's anything that you thought, like, they were really concerned with this particular concept. They kept playing over with it. Like, we talked about consent. We talked about mythology. If not, it's cool. I can cut it off. But if there's anything you're like, oh yeah, the series definitely had this thing that we should address.
Yeah. So. The actor who plays Jack O'Neill is also the actor who played MacGyver.
Right.
And a lot
Richard
of
Dean Anderson.
Staff,
I know this because every preview of Stargate on television when I was a kid would go, Stargate starring Richard Dean Anderson. I knew very much who the protagonist was. Please continue.
Yeah. Well, also a lot of the production crew was, which meant that there's this whole concept of how do we hack the new technology we've encountered to work? How do we improve things over time? How do we integrate this alien stuff into Earth stuff? All of that came up again and again and again because that's the mindset of MacGyver, but now we're doing it in a sci-fi series.
I'll go ahead and I'll wrap it up now, guys. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I loved the enthusiasm you had and the insight you had into this series, and was appreciative of having a diving board on stuff to binge. So thank you for coming on. AJ, where can people talk to you about Stargate? I would assume Reddit.
Yeah, so there's always a rewatch happening, but yeah, so there's always people in the r/r/Stargate subreddit.
So when you say rewatch, do you mean like you guys do like kind of a book club type thing, except you watch an episode at a given time?
Yeah, like usually every year or so, somebody decides that we're going to do we have a spreadsheet that shows, the best order to watch, or not necessarily the best order, just the order in which everything came out, right? Because there's some overlap and things. There's also, some short lists of ones that are must watches. But the best part about Stargate for quarantine, of course, is that there are just so many episodes, right? Mm-hmm. Hundreds of episodes. You can start to watch it from the beginning. And if you decide that you're maybe not going to stick it out, great. But for the rest of us who, you don't just want it to end after one season, you'll have many more. So.
Great. Okay. So it would be like reddit.com/Stargate. Would that be the address?
Yeah, so reddit.com/r/Stargate.
Yes, thank you. Okay.
Subreddit. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, AJ, thank you very much.
There's lots of other communities too. So yeah, check it out. Stargate SG-1, Stargate Atlantis, Stargate Universe. There's a web series called Stargate Origins. There's 2 movies, but for now, I would say start with the beginning, Stargate, the movie from 1994.
Mika, it was delightful talking to you. I can't wait to sneak into the Comic-Con that I invited myself to as a horse.
Yeah, have fun. Such great insight. Thank you.
Yeah, it was wonderful talking to you. Where can people find you? Because I gather that you're doing really interesting stuff. And as noted, you were on the internet. I promise the listeners from this program will be very nice to you and not give you any death threats whatsoever. So where can people find the interesting work you're doing or engage with you online?
Easiest place to find me is probably on Twitter under my name, Mika McKinnon, but I'm on pretty much all social media somewhere sooner or later. I'm even on Reddit very, very rarely, talking about Stargate stuff when people have questions about it. And then depending how the pandemic pans out, there is a Stargate-specific convention in Vancouver. It's called GateCon. And because it's in Vancouver, it has a ridiculously nice proportion of actors and production crew that you don't usually find at the bigger conventions like the creation events and all of that.
Wonderful. Well, guys, thank you so much. That's the show. Thanks for listening. Thank you, AJ West and Mika McKinnon, for sharing your knowledge and your enthusiasm. We'll see you next week. Until then, tally ho!